Before moving on to this stage where you're inking in, first make sure you go into Google Classroom and check your feedback. So there should be some feedback written to you. If there is no feedback, make sure you request some feedback, or you can ask me in person to give you some pointers on the drawing. And it may be perfect. It may be just ready to go. But please check that first before starting with ink, because once you put down the ink, that's permanent. You can't erase up. So just want to point out that when I'm using the ink, I'm creating an outline of sorts, but I'm still trying to maintain some broken lines. I'm still not going thick with my outline. Same kind of rules apply as they did to when you're doing the pencil outline. But you'll notice that with a fine point pen, you can get in a little bit more detail. You can also make things a little bit more accurate with the ink. So I'm making actually some corrections on my drawing as I go. I'm changing some leaves and I'm checking where things are. And that's what I want you to do too. I want you to get more exact. What I don't want you to do is to not look at your reference picture anymore and just go over what you already have with your pencil. I actually want you to take a closer examination, closer inspection of your reference and just make sure you're being faithful to that. It does not have to be a 100% match, but you do want to get the suggestion of the plant correct. Remember, these are scientific illustrations, so you want them to be informative. They should be kind of evidence like science is. It should be truthful. So that's what you should aim for in your drawing too. And it can be a little bit difficult when you have leaves that are curled over or folded. You also want to think about how things overlap. And you can also keep in mind some of those things that we've already talked about, like contour line. How is that line going to really wrap around the form? Now, we're not really going to do shading today. It's more about getting the outline in place, which actually takes a while to do. I do recommend using black ink for this, although any kind of dark pen could work. You also want to make sure that the pen has a fine point to it. The Bic pens that you received in your artist kit will work well with this too. And remember that these are technical drawings, so you want to include detail. You want to try and maintain faithfulness to the subject. If you're doing an animal, you're going to have to think about texture, but the same is really true of the plant too. So in this case, the root texture is different than the leaves. The leaves have that sawtooth shape to them. The roots look kind of rough. They've got that kind of fuzzy quality where all those little tiny roots kind of stick out. And then you have the flowers and the buds. So there are kind of a variety of textures going on in here. One thing you want to make sure that your drawing has is overlap. So one object overlaps another. That gives a little bit of depth or dimension to an otherwise flat plane. And make sure there's enough going on. Your drawing should be at least the size of your hand. Now it can be bigger. I think mine exceeds the size of a hand. It looks like you can fit like almost 2 hands there. So I would say avoid doing too simplistic or too small. Try and get in more information. Draw a second flower in there. Draw another bud or some leaves to make your drawing have interest. And you're going to have to look really closely at the petals. There are flowers that are very simple, like a daisy would be simple, but doing something like a peony or a rose, those have a whole bunch of layers. And you almost want to think of flowers as a sphere instead of a circle. So in the case of the dandelion, I'm seeing it in profile. So it's a semi-sphere in that case. And I would shade it kind of like I would shade a textured sphere. So just stuff to think about. Now, next lesson, I am thinking of allowing you to use watercolor or some form of color. Even color pencil could work on this kind of a drawing. But I also realize that not everyone may have access to watercolors or some form of color. There are some alternatives we can use too, including stuff you might have already around the house to create what's called a wash. But I think if you do have the watercolors, it'll be fun to add some color to them. We're still going to do some more inking next time, so we'll actually get in a little bit more shading, wrapping our line around the form. Not as much as what we were doing with the dessert drawing, so we're not going to have a crosshatch background, but we are going to shade in some areas if they're in shadow. So we will use some crosshatch or some form of one of those shading techniques that we learned and apply that. So you can see that I'm actually correcting. I'm not going over my outline exactly. That means that I will have to at some stage go in there with a big eraser and erase out some of my pencil marks so that they're not just left there kind of misleading the viewer. And this is kind of like what book illustrators do too. In fact, this is the process that most illustrators use. So you can see the drawing that I came up with is fairly simple, but there's multiple objects to engage the viewer. There's also a lot of crossing over, so one line crosses over in front of another, one leaf crosses in front of the other, which gives it some more interest, variety. I'm going to wait to have you submit it until it's fully finished. So don't do anything more to it, just hold on to it for the time being once you're done.